Hi, today we're going to be looking at Chapter 1. So this is our first lecture, and it's going to be an introduction to physiology. We're going to outline some of the basic terminology used for physiology, why we're studying physiology, how it's important, and how it relates to the function of the body. So what is physiology? Well, it is the study of biological function, how the body works. So there's a lot of different components to that. One of those components that is very pertinent to many of your current or future careers as healthcare providers is pathophysiology. Pathophysiology refers to how the body operates in a disease state, and also looking at ways to ameliorate those pathologies. There's also comparative physiology. So this is really useful on an evolutionary perspective, looking at the differences and similarities between organisms. Comparative physiology is also very useful for drug development, because this is why we can use animals, do animal testing for efficacy and then also safety. How does this happen though? So in order to understand how we've accumulated all this knowledge within physiology or any science, we have to understand the mechanisms of the scientific method. So the scientific method is a set of criteria along with reasoning tools that are used to seek and determine truth. So it starts with some observation. So that observation could be anything from looking at the sky and wondering why it's perceived as blue, or asking the question, why do we hiccup? Could be really anything about the natural world. And from these observations, we form what's known as a hypothesis. Well, typically it causes us to pose a question first before we form a hypothesis. So we'll question as to why something is, and if we can't find out the answer, or if it really matters, right? So like if we're looking at blood pressure and it's more important that we seek the truth than use abductive reasoning to come up with our best guess based on whatever information we have around. So we would form a hypothesis, and the hypothesis it's more than just an educated guess. What it is a structured statement that is testable and also falsifiable. So if I made the statement, I saw a UFO, right? That's very difficult to test, right? Because you can't really refute it, but I can't really prove it either. So it has to be something testable. It also has to be ethical, right? There's a lot of tests that we could do that are not ethical. So there's bioethics. Once we have a hypothesis, and it's usually structured in an if-then statement. So if this, then that. That's an easy way to structure a hypothesis. We have to design some type of experiment that is able to accurately determine cause and effect. So in order to do that, we need to have different variables, right? So if we were looking at the growth patterns of plants and of pea plants in the sun or in the dark, we would be looking and trying to control all the other variables. So there's many different variables for that experiment, right? There's humidity, there's soil composition, there's pests, there's temperature, right? And so all those different variables you would want to control between the two groups, so that you could look at the experimental variable, which would be the light intensity, and see how that would affect growth. So once you've set up your experiment and it has controls, and a control can be positive or negative. So a positive control would produce a result, the expected result, and then a negative control would not produce the expected result. you're going to analyze the data. Okay, so the data is really what's important. Now, your presentation of that data can vary, but if we look at a particular experiment and we had 1,000 pea plants and we tested them all in these two different conditions and controlled for all the variables, and we found that 99% of the pea plants that were grown in the dark did not grow significantly at all. So basically they grew maybe a half an inch, and then over the course of 2 weeks, opposed to the other group that was in the sun grew 2.5 feet tall in the course of 2 weeks. Well, you'd have a large amount of data to support if your initial hypothesis was that sunlight will increase and produce growth. So after you've analyzed the data and you have presented your information, the information in the data, statistically, graphs and so on and so forth, you're going to need to make sure that these results can be replicated, because it's possible that this was just a fluke, or there was a mistake and you got these results. So you need to replicate this many, many times before the conclusion that you've come to is accepted as a theory. And after a long time and a lot of testing and a scientific consensus of experts agrees upon it, it will become a general theory.